Welcome again to the first 2021 version of the Southwest Climate Podcast. Mike Crimmins.
Hey, Zach. Happy 2021.
Yeah, it's been since mid-December since we've had a podcast. It doesn't seem like that long, but yeah, this is the new year. Hopefully we can usher in some wetter conditions for this upcoming year, because if I recall, Mike, our last podcast was more of the same, more gloom and doom, but I'm feeling pretty optimistic. How you feeling?
Cautiously optimistic? Yeah, I'm trying to be optimistic, but there's not a lot of reason behind it at this point, climate-wise. So
fair enough.
We'll talk about that today. Yeah,
I'm just trying to be optimistic for the sake of optimism.
No, I'm with you, man. 2021, it's all about optimism.
Okay, great. Well, we got a lot to talk about. All of January has passed since our last podcast. And let me just set the tone here because we came in December with a continuation of the dry conditions. So as everybody remembers, there was a failed monsoon. It was followed by an equally dry fall and early winter. And we talked about drought conditions expanding, in mid-December. We noted the U.S. Drought Monitor classifying a large fraction of Arizona with exceptional drought conditions. I think something like 75% of the state had been in the highest category, which at the time was near record for the U.S. Drought Monitor in terms of how much area in Arizona was classified as drought with exceptional drought. Nonetheless, whether or not that is the right way to think about drought conditions is a side point, Mike. Obviously, we were in sort of a bleak state. So we also talked about La Niña, this developing La Niña, which didn't bode well either. Okay, so that was sort of where we were at the last podcast. We're a month and a half later. Mike, what's happened in January? Do we have any good news to present?
Yeah, I mean, we did. Just like you characterized, coming out of that just epically bad monsoon, fall didn't really give us much. I was really, really concerned. And unfortunately, I still remain pretty concerned that the La Niña situation, the La Niña event that's underway is really going to take the wind out of our sails in any kind of trajectory for drought recovery. So I think when we talked in December, we had in Tucson anyways, we really only had two rain events, two small rain events, one in November, one in December. And I'm not sure we caught the one in December and talked about it. But so looking forward, January and February and March are typically the key months for precipitation accumulation across the Southwest. And they're also when you see that La Niña effect really show up in the historical records, meaning that it would probably bring those months down as far as precipitation may be below average. But we squeaked out a pretty impressive precipitation event in sort of the later half, probably third week, kind of even through the end of the month, precipitation-wise for the Southwest. And really kind of a really unique set of kind of different events that all kind of merged together.
Before we talk about that, by my recollection, there were more or less two events that happened in January that we can unpack a little bit. And they happened kind of back to back, although I'm not sure atmospherically that they were the same event. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, if there's more noteworthy events to talk about. But there was, I believe it was an atmospheric river around January 20th that dumped a whole bunch of rainfall in the sort of Yuma area and a little bit in southeast, a little less so, but still quite a bit in southeast Arizona at the sort of border with Mexico. And that event sort of stayed in the southern tier. And then fast forward like 5-6 days, and then there was actually another event that dropped quite a bit of snow actually in the high country and more widespread rainfall around Arizona and New Mexico. Were there other events that we ought to flag for January?
Those were kind of their main ones. There was another trough move through the Southwest towards the last week of the month, and it kind of was all part of this unsettled weather pattern that settled in, where we were getting sort of a really progressive jet stream pattern and some waves of low pressure systems coming through. But the ones that you described were kind of the big ones, especially for Arizona. And I think that they did give some precipitation for some of the Four Corners states, in really Arizona taking the brunt of it in a good way, precipitation wise, with that colder event.
So let's look at that first event, that the Yuma event, as I'm calling it. Something like an inch, a little bit more than an inch fell in Yuma, which is a huge event for them.
Yeah, and there's even reports of higher. We're looking at sort of the rain log network and some of the other volunteer observer networks. There's some multi-day totals that are up over 2 inches. There was some radar estimated precipitation that put 3, 4, 5 inches of total precipitation between the 19th and the 21st in northern Mexico and northern Sonora. So just sort of southeast of the Yuma area. It was a closed low pressure system sort of dropped down the front of this ridge that's been persistent in the East Pacific. And so that really meridional jet stream pattern caused this low to sort of drop straight south. And then it wasn't quite cut off, but it was such that the jet stream pattern wasn't going to move it forward very quickly. So having it sort of spin in Southern California had a nice southerly, sort of southwesterly southerly flow that was able to tap into some deep subtropical moisture and kind of weave it through some of the mountain ranges of Baja, and also use the Gulf of California as sort of a way to guide up moisture, low level moisture. And so just having that access to low level moisture, the low pressure system itself and its slow movement just caused, rain bands to just continue to rain over the same areas. And so that normally, think of this part of the country as some of the driest places in all of North America. And so for this area to get that many inches over just a couple days in the middle of winter was really, really quite impressive.
Right. But these kinds of events, they happen. I mean, the overall pattern wasn't uncommon. The location maybe was more the location of the precipitation was maybe more uncommon, right?
Yeah, and this, so I was even kind of stepping back and thinking about this from like a La Niña winter, so we've got a very mature La Niña event. It's definitely showing its muscle across all of the Pacific Ocean. The atmosphere is engaged. And in those winters, what you do see, and we were talking about this sort of reading in the literature, is that kind of the typical response is across the whole Pacific Ocean that the mid-latitude jet stream it's moved back further west and retracts a little bit. So the storm track across the Pacific ends up having this little flip towards the northwest in the middle of the Pacific. And that often guides those storms into the Pacific Northwest. And we see that as there's kind of a persistent ridge of high pressure in the East Pacific. But what can happen with that pattern is that ridge on the front side of a ridge is a trough, right? And so sometimes that whole wave pattern can get unstable, and you can have these low pressure systems that form on the front of that wave. And if the wave is really high amplitude, it's kind of like a breaking wave. They can drop really far south, and then they can move very slowly. So we'll see those a lot in the Southwest. But if they're inland, they tend to just kind of move through the area and create some wind to cool down in temperatures. And that's it. And so we see that a lot during normal winters and during La Nina winters. But this one was so high amplitude that it was able to reach a low enough latitude that it was able to pick up some moisture that was just to the south. And that changes the character of these events that you don't even notice into big rainers.
Was it that ridge was pushed a little bit toward the west?
Yeah, I think so. Because that whole ridge can what it'll do is it'll kind of advance and retract, with all sorts of other weather patterns globally kind of nudging it. And I think that's just what you saw. And so we had seen in the early part of the fall and through the fall, this pattern as well, where the ridge would kind of advance on us and we'd warm up, and then the ridge would retract and we'd be in the cool northwesterly flow. You'd have those low pressure systems that would drop down the front side of the ridge. They'd be inland and they would be dry, and they really wouldn't do much other than cool us down. This one got so high amplitude that the low kind of broke off. It didn't totally break off, but it was close and so slow enough that it reached in and got some moisture. And that kind of set the stage for the next event after that as well.
Hold on, before we go there, we need a little atmospheric dynamics 200 for me. So what is causing that ridge to move or to break down? Is it actually caused by the low toward the northwest? Is it like that like a big low pressure system that's moving, that's disrupting the high, or is it something to the south that's causing the high to move that enables that sort of very meridional pattern of the jet stream and the low pressure to sort of move into our area?
I think it depends, and it would depend on kind of the upstream forcings. And so that wave pattern across the Pacific, it'll be influenced by the jet in the far western Pacific. And so the dynamics that are going on there, and then the dynamics across the Pacific. And then if there's any other sort of weather patterns that it might be interacting with, and as well as sort of downstream things that can happen too, that can block up the weather, the wave pattern and kind of impact it upstream. So I don't have a real good diagnosis of this particular event other than sort of watching and looking at watching that event develop and looking at some of the previous weather maps that we had pulled up, and just looking at that sort of ridge position prior to the event, the amplitude of the ridge, and where that low is sort of developing and coming down the front side of the ridge during that event.
This event that we're talking about was relatively a warm event.
Yeah.
Because it was tapping in that subtropical moisture.
This was like the beginning. Like we hadn't seen any rain in quite a while, right? And we'd only had those kind of two small events. So there was a lot of anticipation around it. And there was, the models had picked up on this being a fairly wet event for much of Arizona. And the idea of an atmospheric river sort of tapping into some deep subtropical moisture so we could have high rainfall rates. And so us in Tucson were sitting tight with some pretty big expectation for some wet conditions. But it looked like the low went just a touch further south than was anticipated. So it's even a little bit further away from any cold air if there was any to deal with. And then it just kind of, it took the center of the precip bullseye and shifted them around. And so really only Southwest Arizona and far Southeast Arizona got any decent rain out of this event. And clearly Northern Mexico did as well.
Okay, so fast forward like a week, 6 days, and the second event comes in. And this event produces more widespread rainfall, and it's actually a very cold storm. Here in Tucson, we actually had some snowflakes. The snow level what was the snow level at, Mike? Like 2,500, or was it
Yeah, there were parts of the outskirts of Phoenix that saw snow. So I think it got down to about 2,500, I think. Yeah, I think that was probably the lowest it got.
And so this event isn't tapping as much subtropical moisture, and it's also entraining a lot of cold air from the north.
Yeah, I think it had a little bit of both. So, it was a very cold core to the low pressure system, but then it was also there was still a little bit of a tap to the south. So that's a good situation to produce a lot of snow, because, those cold lows themselves don't end up having a lot of moisture with them because they're cold, their ability to have that. So it's going to end up being this interaction of those cold, low pressure systems being able to draw some moisture up and wrap the moisture around into the system themselves. And I think that's really what you saw here, because it ended up putting down, several feet of snow in parts of the high country Arizona. And it was interesting because it didn't really extend into east central Arizona. And I don't think New Mexico did as well with this particular event. It became more localized as far as where that heavy snow really fell.
I mean, we really needed those events for Arizona. I'm looking at Tucson, and like you said, it had been just a couple events prior to mid-January, end of January. And yet, if you go back all the way to October 1st, something like in Tucson at the airport, close to 3 inches on average falls. That event itself, those two events brought around an inch, and that's helpful and all, but we're still way behind the 8 ball in many parts of, in Tucson and in many other parts of the Southwest. So helpful, Mike, but we need a lot more of that in terms of if we're going to catch up to average at this point.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to I make sure I kind of reinforce the idea that this sort of recent event really did favor Arizona more than it did New Mexico, right? I mean, and it was kind of like Southern California and even Southwest Arizona is interesting because Yuma has had 2 pretty wet winters in a row now, maybe 3. And so it's like it's raining more in some of the drier parts of the state than it is in some of the wetter parts of the state. It's just been kind of on its head. Yeah, the New Mexico did not do as well with this particular event. And it really was even north central Arizona and the Flagstaff areas Flagstaff and Prescott saw a ton of snow out of this event and pushed them up. But some of the other high peaks in Arizona and the far eastern sort of Mogollon Rim area didn't see as much snow out of this event, which was really kind of weird given how widespread it was.
Yeah, I think you just characterized well the spatial pattern of January rainfall. So the Flagstaff area, north central Arizona, slightly above its average. The southwest corner, the Yuma area, much above its average, and parts around the border with Mexico and in southern Arizona above average. Everywhere else below average. So it's a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag, and it was it's just surprising. Once the event occurred and we started to try to do some reconnaissance on where did it help and where didn't it? Just looking at some of the SNOTEL observations, the high elevation SNOTELs around Flagstaff had big jumps, and some of them almost caught up to median for the beginning of February. And I just assumed that the whole Mogollon Rim did well with this event, and it's stark on how bad it is, like around Sunrise and some of the other SNOTEL sites that are kind of on the New Mexico Arizona border.
Yeah, and I think maybe we should zoom out a little bit and talk about the West here, because the picture in terms of snowpack and rainfall across much of the West is a picture of below average conditions. Snowpack, for example, really the sort of north central Arizona, the Flagstaff area at this moment has one of the few places that are above their median in all of the West. Maybe that's an overstatement. There's a few other places that are close to average. For example, the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, Upper Rio Grande is slightly above average. But basically, outside of that, in Colorado and in Wyoming and in Utah, the main sources of the Colorado River, it's pretty darn dry so far. In the Upper Colorado River Basin, looking at the snowpack conditions there, in fact, currently, as of February 3rd, the snowpack conditions in the Upper Colorado River Basin are actually at their lowest levels, or close to their lowest levels they've been in the historical record. So there are some places that are extremely dry. I think it's worth saying that, as you go further north in Colorado and Utah in particular, there's a lot more winter to be had up there. And sort of our pessimism tied to La Niña isn't so great as you go further north. Nonetheless, you always like to be ahead of the game at this moment, and we're not. So I think the snowpack situation is not a great one. It could be worse, but it's not a great one for the West. It's
not encouraging. I had very low expectations for this winter anyways. And so I don't know, this event.
For here though, right? For Arizona, or were you thinking like, Colorado and Utah and?
Yeah, I was thinking more of Arizona, New Mexico. And I think it's a fair point that there is a lot of wind. April 1 is typically peak snowpack, for a lot of those locations. So you got February, March as time to make runs on it. And La Niña is the impact really does sort of decay as you go north across the Southwest. So, Utah and Colorado, historically anyways, don't have a real strong La Niña connection. So you can end up having those storms kind of barrel through there and drop the snow. The outlooks from, Climate Prediction Center, they're not particularly encouraging though, even for the upper basin.
Yeah, it's also worth saying, the peak snowpack kind of in Arizona is a month earlier on average than it is in Colorado and Utah. So, I'm looking at one of the SNOTEL sites here, and the peak is around the end of February, the peak and the median.
Yeah.
It feels a little weird to say that the winter feels like it's more in the behind us and in front of us for some weird reason. That's hard to say as a Vermonter and talking to you and just in February, but it certainly feels like that's the case.
That's a good point, because in Arizona, quote unquote, peak snowpack is typically March 1st. So we got a couple weeks and we're not going to make it, so the Arizona.
Well, we got 3 weeks. Come on.
We got 3 weeks and they don't look that wet. Let's just put it that way. You can talk about that later. So the Southwest isn't going to make it. The upper basin, you're right. It's got a little more time, got a little more chance, but there's this sneaky little thing here that is part of this year, is that we had the driest instrumental record, monsoon, very hot. We had parched soils coming into this winter season. So good, quote unquote, good snowpack or average snowpack is going to go into replenishing soil moisture, and it's not going to do much at all for stream flow. So the only way to solve that situation would have been we needed to have record snowpack this year and then kind of wait and see how it would translate into stream flow. So even if again, Arizona is not going to do it, we're not going to make it. The upper basin, if they pull off Miracle March, awesome April, magnificent May, whatever, that's fine. But I don't even know how that'll translate into stream flow. It's helpful water, and it may help sort of stem some vegetation mortality and that kind of stuff. But the stream flow situation here is in a bad spot, even under, some miracles happening in the next couple of months.
It's interesting about the monsoon's interaction with the winter. And I think there was a recent paper out that talked about that the monsoon actually does play a role in stream flow. And maybe that's not such a novel take, but I thought it was interesting because we tend to think that the winter conditions more of sort of the impacts in the monsoon season, but the rainfall in the monsoon season feeds back on the winter rainfall through stream flow.
The research in the last couple of years is, Connie Woodhouse's stuff too, talking about fall moisture, and then that more recent paper talking about monsoon season. It's a continuum of maintaining soil water that you can generate runoff. And so, we're in this is a really unique situation, at least in the instrumental record, but, the bucket was dry. The soil bucket is going into the winter, had nothing in it. So everything we throw into it right now is just going into filling that bucket up.
Well, and it really calls for, with those conditions, it really calls for the need for an above average winter, just to get average stream flow, for example.
That's right. And that's why you see the stream flow forecasts are not good, and they're getting worse, as time goes on.
So the other point I wanted to make is, so I was sort of tracking down this question about, you said that, Arizona's not going to make up those deficits. And I was just looking at the data at Tucson. We've had about an inch of rain this winter, and from October through April, we average here at Tucson around 5 inches. So the question is, are we going to get the additional 4 inches of rain? And so I went back in the instrumental record for the Tucson airport, dug in the 75 years of data. And Mike, how many of those 75 years do you think there were more than 4 inches of rain in the February, March, April period, which is the amount of rain that we would need to break even at the Tucson airport?
Well, you slacked it to me, and so I have this in my in my mind. It was I don't know, it was 5 or 6.
No, 3.
3. Oh,
all right, 3 out of 75. So okay, so you're saying there's a chance. But we can slice and dice up these numbers even more. So the top three in terms of rainfall over the February, March, April period were all El Nino years. And the next 3, so the top 6, were also El Nino years.
Yeah, none of them were La Nina, were they?
None of them were La Nina. In fact, I ran out of time before I could get to the La Nina year. So I think you're right. I agree with you, and this anecdotal data point agrees with you as well.
Yeah, I would love to be wrong, but this is, and I often am, but this is, I don't know, this just, February, March, and April we're not going to come anywhere close to average precip across the Southwest.
I think this brings up a La Nina question, which is, I'd gotten a couple emails, particularly after those last two events in late January, mid to late January. There were comments about, oh, this isn't characteristic of La Niñas. And I think we have to step back here and say that basically on average during a La Niña year, we get 10 days of rain or around that time, around that number every single year, every single La Niña, or on average during a La Niña. And these things happen.
Yeah, on average. And we have in the recent past some even drier La Niña winters. 2017, 2018 was another La Niña. And it was, up until this point, quite a bit drier than what we're seeing right now. So the fact that we've squeaked something out is not, like you said, it's not necessarily unusual for a La Niña winter. But when we look at the winter as a whole, which is the way you need to when you look at these La Niña events, when we get through the end of April, and we'll do this, it's not going to look great, and it'll be in the same class as those other La Niña, moderate to strong La Niñas for the Southwest.
We tend to harp on, I think, we jump on the El Nino La Niña bandwagon pretty strongly, Mike. But I think there's reason for particularly for La Niña. I mean, when you look at some of their statistics, so in the last 75 years, there's basically been an even split between the winters that have had El Nino, the winters that have had a neutral conditions and a La Niña, about 25, 25, and 25. It's slightly different than that, but it's close. And the average during the La Niñas is the lowest out of those three. But also the variance is pretty low. The variability of the rainfall during a La Niña winter is lower. So it's just harder, I guess, to have that lucky winter in which it is a La Niña and you end up getting above average conditions.
The Southwest isn't a particularly wet place. And so, the La Niña, as we talked about, it takes some of those big storms kind of off, like the frequency of those big storms off the table.
I think that's it. And you kind of explain the mechanisms, but statistically, on average, so I looked at Tucson, Phoenix, I looked at the major cities here in the Southwest, Tucson, Phoenix, Flagstaff, El Paso, and Albuquerque. And I just looked at the number of rainy days during the December, January, February period. Trying to get at this question, does the La Niña event take a few days of rain off the table? Turns out it does, as you would expect. So averaged across those five cities during a La Niña event, on average, there's about 11 rainfall days during the December, January, February period. Whereas the El Nino winters has 16. If we thought about the winters as, and looked at the neutral conditions as sort of like non-ENSO influenced winters, the number of days is about 13. So right in the middle. So I think you're exactly right. Like there's fewer storms that come down into our region. Therefore, there's lower means, and because there's fewer storms, there's lower variability around that mean. And you can look at a whole bunch of other statistics that all say the same thing.
Brushing back up and reading some of these papers on ENSO or El Nino, La Nina impacts and impact on the circulation patterns is that that sort of classic El Nino response, when you get that extended subtropical jet with the storm track kind of pointed at the Southwest, that's a really efficient way of bringing storm systems that actually produce precipitation into the Southwest. Whereas, if you were to count the number of like low pressure systems that are coming through the Southwest, a lot of those don't produce measurable precip. So they're just kind of qualitatively different than the kinds of storms that you get in a really good solid El Nino winter. Man, I want to see a good solid El Nino winter. I'm going to bring it up again. 15, 16 really let me down.
Two other questions. I'll just throw them out to you right now. We can take them one at a time. Did January matter in terms of drought? Right, we got some rainfall. It was around average in some places. Did that matter? Did that make a dent? Like, we can talk about the drought picture in a minute. The second one is, I'm just curious, Mike, if you have a 2020-21 looks like this year kind of analog.
Okay, so that first question, did it matter? Yeah, I did. I mean, it all rain's good rain. Can't turn our nose up at any of it. It was numerous storms over multiple days. It's during the middle of the winter when evapotranspiration is low and most vegetation is dormant. So that means it's actually going to go into recharging soil moisture. It put down a lot of snow at upper elevations. It helped snowpack, not everywhere. So qualitatively, it's going to help improve soil moisture conditions that will be beneficial for vegetation that starts to try to grow in a couple of months as we warm up and we kind of break dormancy on that stuff. It might help on wildfire risk, but I don't know. I think it's still pretty far out. This water right now, it could go deeper in the soil and stuff could dry out again. Like we have so many instances in the past where in good snowpack years, the snowpack gets eaten up by really warm conditions in March and you're into high fire risk and drought stress pretty quickly. So I mean, it was helpful, but we could lose a lot of the gains that we've made pretty quickly because we're going to probably dry out and warm up again. So, and my last point is that snowpack is great as long as it melts slowly and is sustained into the spring and isn't sublimated. Because if the atmosphere comes back and just takes the snow back into the atmosphere, it's water lost in the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's the improvement is reflected a little bit in the U.S. drought monitor. Most of Arizona, 53% of it is still an exceptional drought, like their highest drought category. But that's down from about a month ago from 74%. So it's made some changes, particularly around that Yuma area where a lot of that first event rainfall fell. So, but yeah, we still have, February to deal with, and La Niña's a moderate version of it. The forecast, which we'll talk about in a minute, doesn't look great for the next couple months, for the next couple weeks, and actually even further. Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on it. But I think you're right, Mike. I do think that in a lot of ways we're in a pretty unique situation here, coming out of the summer season and also into this La Niña. So
yeah.
And so with that, Mike, do you have any analogs? Have you thought about this year in relation to past years for some insights?
I had a hopeful analog going into it. And so I latched on in my brain to, and this was wish casting more than it was anything else. It was 2007, 2008, which was a pretty strong La Niña event where at least Tucson anyways, and some parts of the Southwest actually, it's so sad the bar was so low. It still was a below average winter, but the frequency of the precip was more frequent than we've even seen this particular winter. So that was like where you had some similar events, like we just saw this last week, but you had a couple of them. And I think that's maybe the best kind of La Niña winter you can squeak out for the Southwest. We're not going to come close to that right now. I think you have a better analog in your mind.
In my mind, it's 2011, 2012. And the analog is because I was looking at both the sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific and also the atmospheric indices, Southern Oscillation Index, and they had similar patterns. The sea surface temperatures weren't as strong as your analog, but the pattern of the atmosphere response was similar and pretty strong during the 2011-2012 year. And then if you just look at if that's an analog and you look at just the Tucson airport as a proxy, it's actually a better winter overall than the one that you suggested, but it's tipped very heavily by the early season and a few large events. And if basically from January on, there was few events and a few amounts of precipitation. So, if it didn't get, one event of 1 inch and a couple other events that had, half, 3/4 of an inch, it would have been a much bleaker situation. So, it's hard to say. I think both those analogs kind of paint a, what's the word, Mike?
Is bleak too strong of a word?
I've used it.
I know. I'm tired. Yeah. I'm tired of saying it. It could. I'm like looking at your 2011, 2012. I just pulled up Flagstaff. The storm activity actually, they had a couple of events February, March, and April in, the northern part of the state, which it's not unheard of for La Nina winters, because that signal is weaker as you go further north. So you don't get locked in. I think the southern parts of Arizona and New Mexico, we lose our chances for winter precip. It kind of goes down every week as you get deeper into the spring. So, I mean, none of the outlooks, and the outlooks aren't always right, but man, it would have to be something, kind of miraculous at this point, I think.
I mean, it's worth saying, although I think most of our listeners know, I mean, there's no predictive power in one analog. You try to do a little matching to see if there's anything that you can glean from it. But despite like those indices that I pointed out, like being similar between the 2 years, I mean, if you look at the sea surface temperature pattern, currently it's very different than it was in 2011, 2012. Currently, like the really cold water is south of the equator, and the cold water during the 2011, 2012 winter was more symmetrical around the equator. And that pattern matters. And so when you look at these like indices that boil down a large swath of the ocean into one number, I mean, you can obscure the pattern. So all of that is just to say that it's a little bit of a folly to try to think about analogs as being a useful way to think about the future. But
well, it's just nice to see different outcomes, right? Like if every outcome was exactly the same and it didn't rain at all, then that would be one thing. But we see different outcomes. I don't know. It's just like all indications are that we're in a bad spot. It's probably not going to get a lot better. And, we're going to have to weather, I think, some serious water situations in the spring and, probably wildfire too. And then, we'll be looking forward to monsoon season.
So the models are like looking out to the seasonal for the next, 3 months, February, March, April period. All of the models are picking up on La Nina's strength, not strength. It's grip.
Persistence.
On the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Looking under the hood of the North American multi-model ensemble, every single one of their models has dry conditions over this 3-month period. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to say. What did you look at the short-term forecast, like the 7 to 10 days, the 2-week forecast? Is there any hope?
No. No, it was supposed to rain today. I don't know if you remember this. Like a week ago, there was a lot of the models had latched onto the system, and it just every day it got closer. It just kind of fell apart, and it's just a beautiful day out right now. The 8 to 14 day, the week 3-4, the 1 month, and the 3 month, like you said, they all look like La Nina. So again, there could be another kind of unsettled weather pattern, period of unsettled weather for the Southwest that maybe emerges in March. I don't know. I mean, like it's possible, but like everything we've talked about too, that'll be helpful and beneficial. And if we can get some precip event, like even small ones a little bit further into spring, that'll help with the wildfire risk. Where we're at right now and where we've just been, it's just not enough to win the game at this point.
Do you expect a couple more, like a week of unstable weather, there to be another like week period of unstable weather? I mean, would you expect that just based on climatology?
It's a 50-50 chance, there's no information to support. I mean, it's absolutely possible. And I think if you looked at La Nina winters, probably half would have had something and half wouldn't. So like, I don't know if there's any information around it. I mean, there's nothing to say it couldn't happen, but is it possible for us to just kind of ride out the other couple of months with very little activity? Absolutely. Like we've seen that in the recent past.
If we ended this winter with the amount that we've had thus far, it would put a lot of pressure on an early monsoon to start. The fire risk would probably be through the roof.
We're in a tough spot. This event, like if we didn't have that event like a week ago, this conversation wouldn't be a lot different, but it'd be so much more dire. Like if we hadn't gotten that stuff, but it's just like that was great, but we need 3-4 more of those to even start talking digging a little deeper to see, if we're making big improvements.
So when did you start paying attention to Southwest climate? What year, more or less? I'm just curious.
So when I went to school here in 2000, so like 21 years ago.
Do you remember a time in that last 20 years where it was similar or worse than this? Or is this in terms of impacts of dry conditions?
Oh yeah, like 2001. Like, remember when it didn't rain for 100 and some days?
That was before my time. I mean, I've heard everybody talk about that, but I wasn't paying attention.
2017, 2018, more recently was bad. We had one substantial precip event. I keep talking about this one too. It was like right over Valentine's Day, and it was a really wet subtropical. It was like an atmospheric river basically that came straight up out of the south. That would have been in February of 2018, but that was one of the last La Niñas, and that was the record hot and dry fall. Then the early winter was also very warm and dry, and then it was weird because it started to actually rain again and snow in the upper elevations in like April. And the upper basin actually had a little bit of a catch up. It helped a bit. And, it's like the upper basin, like we talked about we're just kind of belaboring it now, but there's a little bit more room probably for some catch up there, but it's going to take some pretty active weather pattern to hammer it. The Southwest proper, like we are, I don't know. It's highly unlikely.
2017, 2018, I'm looking at it right now, and that basically just had 2 events all winter.
Yes, right.
Well, here's to hoping.
That's great. Wasn't it before I was the optimist and you were the pessimist? And like, we've completely switched bodies. I don't understand what has happened.
Well, I'm just grabbing onto anything. I'm just so beat down by it,
Yeah.
Part of me, to be honest, I like the tales, whatever those tales are. It's just more interesting. And this is like, I'm intellectualizing this because I don't actually.
And for the listener, that's tales of the distribution. Let's just be clear there.
Yeah, sorry. I trailed off there. I'm intellectualizing this because I don't actually make a living off of the climate in a way that many people do. So the extreme conditions are just a little bit more interesting from my perspective. But yeah, I am not sure where to go with this. Other than to say that it at least gives us something to talk about. Although we would always find something to talk about. There's always some nuance in, I think, the weather. So maybe that's not such an important point. But
no, absolutely. And again, it was like, I'm so cool that we had that more recent weather come through the Southwest, because it was fantastic. I mean, it lifted my spirits, absolutely. And I do think it helped. But man, we need more.
Yeah, and I also think it's always interesting to try to diagnose why the extremity happened, why the extreme event happened, more so than trying to characterize an average winter. Be a lot of learning that comes from this.
Absolutely.
So, Mike, anything else that you want to hit before signing off?
I think we're in good shape. I'm just doing my monsoon countdown in my head. I don't quite know the days off the top of my head, but we're getting closer.
We need to have that on your website. It's like days to the monsoon countdown.
Good idea.
All right. Well, it's good talking with you, and we'll come back in a month, and we'll report on the state of the climate here in the Southwest. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a great rest of your month.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, everyone.
It's 131 days.
131 days.
That's not so bad.
Yeah, it's like 4 months.
It's weird to think that in just 4 months, we're going to go from like the weather today to 40 degrees warmer.
How'd you like that introduction? Articulating your name like that. Mike Crimmins.
It's theatrical.